Soviet military assistance to Africa was largely provided on a half-grant basis, although each aid package tended to be somewhat limited in scope. Typically, the recipients of aid would only receive enough to cover their needs for 2 to 3 days. To ensure a steady flow of assistance, the Soviet Union often exchanged aid for access to airports and ports. By employing this strategy, the Soviet Union had secured usage rights for more than 20 airports and ports in Africa by 1981, even establishing monitoring bases in Ethiopia. After 1975, due to access to Angolan ports, the Soviet Navy expanded its activities from West Africa to South Africa, posing a significant threat to Western oil shipping routes. Furthermore, although the Soviet Union was resource-rich, not all resources were abundant, and Africa provided a means to supplement these shortages. As an example, consider the case of Guinea in West Africa. When it gained independence, the country was impoverished and had been extensively damaged by the French. With $170 million in aid from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, Guinea managed to survive. In return, Guinea opened up its bauxite mines to the Soviet Union. This accounted for approximately 30% of the Soviet Union's aluminum requirements, which were met through Guinea. The Soviet Union was also a major fishing nation, with an annual catch of up to 10 million tons, second only to Japan globally. However, about half of this catch came from the exclusive economic zones of other countries, primarily in Latin America and Africa. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, in 1978, the Soviet Union's fishing in the coastal waters of East Africa amounted to 848,000 tons, whereas the total catch by coastal African countries was only 958,000 tons. The situation in West African coastal waters was not much better, with 30% of the catch being taken by the Soviet Union. However, it was not feasible for the Soviet Union to achieve profitability through these mineral and fish resources alone. For the Kremlin, aiding Africa was always a business of incurring losses to gain influence. As Khrushchev once said, fundamentally, they were selling communism to Africa, but in reality, they had to pay to make Africans buy into their ideology. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, this subsidized model was no longer sustainable. After the Soviet Union's dissolution in the late 20th century, Russia's GDP plummeted sharply, with inflation rates exceeding 2,500%. President Yeltsin announced a complete halt to aid and urged African countries to repay subsidies. 2 years later, Russia's government formulated a foreign policy plan that ranked Africa second to last in terms of importance, just above Latin America. Russian-African trade also suffered a steep decline, with only $740 million in 1994, roughly at the level when the Soviet Union initially engaged with Africa. Russian scholars refer to this period as the withdrawal from Africa. After the Russians left, Africa's situation did not improve, rather, it lost more power and was increasingly marginalized on the global stage. Starting in 2011, North African countries suffered during the Arab Spring. Libya entered a state of dual governance with armed factions, Tunisia's GDP declined by 12%, and per capita income dropped by 18%. Egypt experienced 2 political upheavals, foreign exchange shortages, economic downturns, and skyrocketing inflation. The food crisis reached life-threatening levels, and even a rise in bread prices could trigger political crises. The average annual Arab Spring led to nearly 3 million people being displaced, with many choosing to head south and join extremist groups. The Sahel region, stretching from Senegal in West Africa to Eritrea in East Africa, was predominantly within France's sphere of influence. As previously mentioned, France created the CFA franc, initially pegged to the French franc and later the euro. This gave many former colonies partial currency sovereignty. However, even after gaining independence, these countries were still required to deposit 100% of their reserves with the French treasury, which served as capital for France. This was later reduced to 50% and was not completely eliminated until 2019. The CFA franc covered over 960,000 square miles and was used by 14 countries, 11 of which were certified by the United Nations as the least developed. Despite these arrangements benefiting France, they did take some action in Africa. In 2013, they launched Operation Serval to combat anti-government militants threatening the capital, ultimately rescuing Mali's fragile government. However, after military action, the French remained, and they did not assist Mali in fully eradicating the insurgents, which allowed the situation to deteriorate further. Given the tumultuous political and economic conditions in Africa, African countries are not necessarily hoping for the return of the Soviet Union, but they do desire the intervention of a foreign power to stabilize the region and prevent further turmoil. After the Crimea crisis, Russia faced sanctions and sought new markets and political partners outside the West. Since then, Russia has increased its efforts to re-establish a presence in Africa. However, Russia's re-engagement in Africa remains limited. In 2020, it amounted to only $14 billion, accounting for approximately 2% of Africa's total foreign trade. Russia primarily maintains its influence in Africa through arms sales. Over the past decade, Russia has consistently been the largest arms supplier to Africa. In 2021, he contracted for over 40% of Africa's weapons imports, covering one-third of African countries. Algeria and Egypt are the main buyers of Russian-style weapons in Africa, accounting for half of Africa's arms imports from Russia. Compared to Western offerings, Russian weapons are sold without any political conditions attached, and are relatively inexpensive. For many economically challenged African nations, Russia also provides post-sale services such as old equipment maintenance and upgrades. Africa's population is growing rapidly, but the power supply is lagging behind, with about 600 million people without access to electricity, making it one of the regions with the lowest electrification rates globally. Russian energy companies, facing economic challenges at home, have been exploring opportunities in Africa. One standout in energy cooperation is the Russian State Nuclear Company, which, with its efforts, has signed cooperation agreements with 18 African countries, including Ethiopia, Ghana, Nigeria, Rwanda, Sudan, and more. They are building a nuclear power plant in Egypt valued at $30 billion, with 85% of the funding provided by Russia. This is Egypt's first nuclear power plant and the largest project in Russia-Egypt cooperation since the Aswan High Dam. When doing business in Africa, Russian companies are keen on resource development. One major business area is the extraction of rare metals, which Russia lacks for some strategic metallurgical and manufacturing processes, such as manganese, chromium, titanium, aluminum, and bauxite. These metals are abundant in many African countries, making Russian mining giants active in the continent. In Angola, which was once closely allied with the Soviet Union, Russian company Alrosa controls 60% of diamond mining. In the agricultural sector, Russia's grain exports to Africa have exceeded one-third of the world's total grain exports. The Russian Ministry of Agriculture, led by Minister Dmitry Patrushev, has been instrumental in leading Russian-African food cooperation. Many of these collaborations are facilitated by individuals close to Putin, and they often involve politicians with historical ties to Russia. During the Cold War, many African leaders studied in the Soviet Union or received military training from Soviet forces, and Russia has rekindled these relationships as it re-engages with Africa. However, Russian diplomacy in Africa also faces challenges. The nostalgia for the Soviet era is limited among the younger generation of African politicians. Russia's influence doesn't match that of the United States in terms of economic assistance or cultural soft power. Russia's presence on the African continent often involves opportunistic efforts with low investment, rather than substantial efforts to help Africa overcome its challenges. It's also susceptible to being replaced by more heavily invested major powers. As the legacy of relationships wanes, Russia's diplomacy in Africa, built on Soviet-era connections, is increasingly becoming a game played by older generations, with fewer players and diminishing influence.